better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And will this be okay for the camera? Okay. So great, thank you everybody for being here. Welcome. My name is Bhairavi Desai. I'm the Executive Director of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, and I'm also the President of the National Taxi Workers Alliance. And today is actually the first conference that we are having with all of the affiliates of the National Taxi Workers Alliance. And this is very much a national TWA event, which as New York, we're so pleased to host here. Just a little bit of quick background. The National Taxi Workers Alliance is an affiliate of the AFL-CIO, which is the biggest labor federation in the United States, as well as an affiliate of the 5 million member International Transport Workers Federation, ITF. So we're very pleased that this convening was put together both by the National TWA and the ITF with representatives from the AFL-CIO. There is no question that these have been quite turbulent times in the taxi and for hire vehicle industry. The main topic of our convening and of this panel will be the impact of, what many of these companies, these rogue companies, have called quote-unquote rideshare. We absolutely reject that term. Just as when the main company that's at the head of this new economic model in the transportation industry is, of course, Uber. And, with their $40 billion war chest, Uber, for example, does not calls drivers partners. Well, in the same way that no one is sharing the ride, in that same way, drivers are not partners in that $40 billion war chest. Workers are workers, and within this model, what is happening to professional workers is they're losing their jobs. Under quote-unquote rideshare, it basically means that any transportation company is using through the app, they're dispatching jobs, professional fares for hire to private motorists, private licenses, private insurance. That means the riders are not being covered by commercial insurance. There is no proper security background checks or training, because there is no licensing process for the individual driver. These are private motorists. Imagine, from our perspective, for those of you who are journalists in the room, imagine those of us who know how to put a story together, walked into your news offices and, said to the editors, well, we can cover for you just like anybody else. Somebody who's a professional, who's been trained within the ethics of that profession. And we know that increasingly that within the American economy, there's a growing trend where workers are losing their jobs, not just due to unemployment, but because of reclassification, no longer being considered workers, no longer being considered employees. 1/3 of the American workforce are now contingent workers, like independent contractors such as taxi drivers. 30 years ago, drivers were on the front lines of an economic shift where commissioned employee taxi drivers became independent contractors who were forced to go into leasing. The bosses used to pay for gasoline, and whatever was on the meter was split with the driver. 30 years later, drivers begin each day at a negative, no longer considered employees with the right to a union contract, even minimum wage or overtime protections, even protection under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, even though taxi drivers are 30 times more likely to be killed on the job than any other worker. We have lost every single basic protection across the country as independent contractors. The few protections that our struggles have won at local levels, either workers' compensation or disability, or a maximum cap on how much the companies can charge you for the lease, all of these protections are now being trampled on with this new economic model. Just like we were on the front lines of an attack 30 years ago, as workers, we are on the front lines of a new economic model today. And we absolutely believe that unless this type of an economic model, which at the heart of it is about consolidating profits for multi-billion-dollar companies at the expense of both the worker and the consumer, unless this is stopped and brought under proper regulation, just as we have been for decades, it will be a decline for millions of workers across many industries within our economy, not only in this country, but in many countries across the world. And so we have convened with this urgency, and while in New York City itself, we have not seen this idea of so-called rideshare. For example, Uber X in New York is a livery and black car service, but they're using the millions that they're making here to promote a destructive economic model that is crushing our brothers and sisters in other cities. Boston, Chicago, these cities with large taxi markets are being decimated. And taxi drivers in this city are now facing a threat to our livelihood that we have not seen in years. A livelihood that is earned after 12-hour shifts, 60 hours a week, with no basic protections or benefits on the job. When you start out working poor, you have very little room to go down. But that's where we are being forced to go into deeper crisis levels of poverty. And so we've gathered through this convening to expose the reality of what is happening, to send the message of urgency of what is happening, and to say unequivocally that taxi drivers across this country and across the globe, we are organizing ourselves to mount an offense, to defend our rights, and to win back our livelihoods. So in that spirit, I would like to introduce to you our panelists for this conference. We have representatives here from San Francisco, Philadelphia, Austin, Texas, Montgomery County, Maryland, and in New York City. We are the 5 cities of the National Taxi Workers Alliance, and we are very pleased to also have here with us representative from Brussels, Belgium, where really they've been leading the fight throughout Europe on this new economic model in our industry. So I would like to first begin with our brothers and sisters from San Francisco, Mark Gruberg and Chakib Ayadi. San Francisco longtime veteran taxi drivers, activists, board members of the San Francisco Taxi Workers Alliance.
Thank you, Bhairavi. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mark Gruberg. I'm a board member of the San Francisco Taxi Workers Alliance and the San Francisco Taxi Alliance. First thing I'd like to say has to do with the terminology, specifically the term ride sharing. This term is a complete misnomer. And I think it's interesting the way it came into use. Hello? Is that better? Okay. So the term ride sharing was first employed by companies like Uber and Lyft and another company called Sidecar because they were trying to gain acceptance in California as a completely unregulated type of service. And California law says that if you are a true rideshare, you don't come under any regulation at all. So they approached the California Public Utilities Commission, which had already issued cease and desist orders against these companies, and they said, well, you can't regulate us. We are simply technology companies that are providing our riders, our drivers with rides, and the drivers are simply doing ride share. Well, the problem for them was that the definition of ride sharing says that the ride has to be between two people going in the same direction for a work-related purpose and not for profit. And they were deceitfully trying to say that this is what was happening, that these were simply people riding around in their private cars, and if somebody happened to be going in their direction, they'd take them along. And they even had a business model for this, which they claimed was a voluntary donation. So at the end of the ride, you would get charged whatever the ride cost, but you could override that in your app, and you wouldn't have to pay. And of course, people who did this 2 or 3 times found that they could never get a ride again. But that was their business model, and they tried to sell this ride-sharing idea, and it got completely shot down. And the California Public Utilities Commission said unequivocally, you are not ride-sharing, you're a commercial transportation business, and you are a transportation business, you're not merely an app, you're not merely a technology company. These things were said. They still insist that they are not transportation companies, and the name rideshare has unfortunately become extremely widespread, and I hope that no member of the media in this group uses that term, except, perhaps to explain that it's the wrong way to characterize it. So another thing I'd like to be aware of, another myth about this, is that these companies are pioneers in technology. In fact, San Francisco, which you may know is the hub of the tech world, had apps that the taxi industry was using before any of these companies existed. There was an app that was formerly called Cabulous. It's now called Flywheel. It is in virtually every San Francisco taxi now, and soon will be. Another app that was formerly called Taxi Magic and is now Curb is very widespread in San Francisco. And we had this technology first. They were not the pioneers of this technology. They were certainly very good at marketing it and getting venture capitalists to invest in them, which gave them the opportunity to market it. And the media has done a wonderful job of publicizing them free of charge. And so they got a leg up on the taxi industry in that sense. But they were not the first with this technology. They just simply were able to exploit it more efficiently. Legality. They went into business completely against the law. They had no legal right to do what they were doing. And they're still doing this around the world. I think you'll hear more about that. These are companies, and particularly Uber. It's an arrogant company. It's a company that has, contempt for the law, and basically is willing to set up any place that they so desire and dare the authorities to stop them. And unfortunately, they've gotten away with it too many times. And this same philosophy, it's a kind of a no-holds-barred, laissez-faire, free market philosophy. It permeates their operations. In terms of the privacy of the individual, I don't know if you're aware of their God view function, where they have been known to track individual people, just for demonstration purposes at some of their meetings, to show that, here's so-and-so in one of our cars on a certain street, and and display that for an audience. When you sign up for one of these companies as either a driver or a rider, you sign away all of your rights. There's a very, very lengthy click-through contract that you have to sign, and from top to bottom, it's filled with waivers of liability, denial of responsibility, and so forth. So, it's a company without a social conscience. And basically, it consists of what I consider to be a parasitic business model, where the taxi industry is an essential service that is provided to the public, and they come in on top of that service. They suck off, a certain portion of the ridership of that service, and allow the taxi industry to serve the rest of the public. But they do things like surge pricing, which is not in the public interest, and they even do it at times of crisis. So, when Superstorm Sandy came through, they surge priced. When there was a hostage situation in Australia, they surge priced. These are not companies that are operating in the public interest. They're operating, in their own financial interest, and the public be damned. So there needs to be a balance restored. There needs to be a level playing field. There needs to be decisions made on a regulatory level, on a government level, that make sure that the public is being served in the way that it should be served. And let me, at this point, turn it over to Chakib Ayadi, who is another member of our San Francisco Taxi Workers Alliance board, to tell you a little bit more about the effects that these companies are having on San Francisco capital.
I am Chakib Ayadi, a board member of San Francisco Taxi Worker Alliance. Our mission is to provide unifying force to protect working condition and fair business practices toward all cab drivers. We strive to promote a healthy industry that will attract quality drivers and foster a well-informed taxi population. I want to mention that there is a global attack from the TNCs in our industry, and this has become a global fight, and we will never, never, never give up. In San Francisco, the ability of ride service companies and drivers to operate free of city regulation or control has had a significant negative impact on the environment in terms of congestion and vehicle emission. Deservedly affected taxi drivers and taxi services sharply reduced cab drivers' income and forcing many to seek another employment, and has dealt a heavy blow to the city's taxi industry. And unfair competition is squashing taxi industry in San Francisco. Therefore, drivers are suffering greatly. I can say that we are facing a historic bottom, but we feel we are confident and we're gonna win that battle. And we feel that the city should exercise their authority to protect public safety, to prevent insurance fraud, to ensure compliance with disability laws, ADA Act, and to preserve the environment, to allow cab drivers to earn a livable income. TNCs don't care about the customers or their own workers. They only care about the profit. As Mark said, we used to have an app before they said they exist. We used that app for a long time before. There is nothing new in here. Nothing is new, except who's making the profit. A member of common sense indicator point that the fact that ride service are indeed providing taxi services. Therefore, similar services must operate under similar rules. At the end, I want to send a message to the whole world and ask people, do you care about your safety? Do you know who's driving you around? Are you insured as a passenger? Do you choose insurance or cheese? I want to ask the public, how do you like the surge pricing? Taxi cab don't do that because we don't take advantage of people. Another question that I have for the public. Do you know who is driving you around? That they pass through background check? And I'd like to end with this. We are the change that you're going to see in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Chakib. Our next speaker, we're so honored to have with us our friend, our brother, Frank Moreels, who is the co-president of the transport union BTB. So straight from Brussels, Belgium, brother Frank Moreels.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. As said, my name is Frank Moreels. I'm the co-president of a Belgian transport union. We are covering different sectors in the transport sector in Belgium. We cover truck drivers, bus drivers, and also taxi drivers. Belgium is a small country in the center of Europe, with Brussels as the capital of the European Union. We have only 35,000 square kilometers and 11 million inhabitants, so there is a big scale difference between the states and the country where I come from. Let me tell you something about the taxi sector in my country and about the problems we have with Uber coming in this taxi sector. We have about 9,000 taxi drivers in our country, and it's quite differently organized than in the States. Let us say that 30% of the taxi drivers are independent, self-owner drivers, but the rest of them, so the big majority, 6,500, are employed taxi drivers. So they are taxi drivers, but they are in fact riding for an employer. I can say also that the taxi sector in Belgium is a quite regulated sector. The different regions regulate the sector. I won't give the technical details, but let us say that there are quite a lot of rules to organize taxi services in my country. There is inspection of the car yearly, there is insurance ruling, there is driver backup check, there is medical screening, and so on. I must tell you also that in the country where I come from, in Belgium, we have regulation also on social level. There is a general social security system which regulates pension, healthcare, unemployment benefit for everyone who works. It's a general system organized by employers, unions, and government. And there is also a sector system, so we have in our taxi sector a social fund. I understood that also here in New York, taxi drivers would like to have a social fund as we are. It was realized in the taxi sector in Belgium for everyone who is active in the sector. And this fund organizes different advantages for taxi drivers, such as in case of occupational disease, unemployment, they organize outplacement, payback in case of an accident, and so on. So we have a regulated taxi sector and we have regulated social relationship. And it is in that market that a year and a half ago Uber came in. They came in unannounced. They were talking with nobody. They knew, I think, that there was a regulation in the sector, but they didn't follow this ruling or these rules. So, from the beginning on, Uber operated in Belgium, in Brussels, in an illegal way. They are only organizing Uber Pop, so it's with the application that they work. It are private drivers, private cars that are, in our eyes, organizing taxi services. As I said, they are not respecting the taxi legislation. They are illegal, but they say, well, in fact, we are not illegal because we are not a taxi company. We are just an IT interface between a driver and someone who is searching for a lift. They are so pretending not being a taxi company, so they must not follow the rules of the taxi sector. We pretend that they are not a ride-sharing company, and what they do is in fact organizing unfair competition and social dumping in the sector. So what was the reaction of politics in Belgium? First, when they came in, there was a reaction of the minister who was responsible for taxi sector, and she took position not against Uber. She publicly said that Uber was welcome in Belgium, but that Uber had to follow the rules of the sector just as every other taxi company should do it. Because they were breaking Belgian law, she reacts, and she put inspections on the road, and there were seizures of cars because they were operating in illegality. Last year we had elections. There was a new minister who was responsible for the taxi sector. He was a little bit hesitating how to act towards Uber because he was open to the argumentation that innovation in the sector should be organized. But after examining, and of course also after trade union actions, because we were not on our chair waiting just as to the market was totally deregulated, we had actions as BTB, and I must say that political responsibles and the minister reacted in the way we would like that he react. So he put inspections on the road, and he banned the activities of Uber. Since there was also a banning by Uber by commercial cars in Belgium. The problem with Uber now is that they are still active, even though they have been condemned by court, even though that they are banned in Brussels. Seemingly they have very much money to spend, and so they still operate in Brussels and they pay the fines that they have to pay. There is also a lot of political pressure on our minister. There are political parties and political responsibles who say, well, Uber is innovative, the rules in Belgium are not modern, so they should change, and we should accept the coming of Uber in the sector. As a trade union, we won't accept this situation. It's an attack, in our view, against the workers, against what we constructed as a social status for the workers. It will, there will be a loss of jobs, we think. We think that good jobs that exist nowadays in the taxi sector will be replaced by bad jobs that are not paid as it should be and that have not the social advantages that we have now. So for us, it is a big disadvantage for the rider. It is deregulating the market, and we won't accept it. The situation is still that they are banned in Brussels. They are operating in illegality. So let us say that as a Belgian union, We have won a battle, but we certainly not have won the war, and we will stay very attentive at what happens and try to block them in Brussels, because we think it's not a good thing for the taxi drivers in our country. Thank you.
For coming out and listening to us this morning. I would like to start off by saying that the impact of Uber entering into a regulated market has totally decreased the income of all taxi drivers within the Southern Hemisphere and all over the world. We, as a regulated industry, have to abide by what regulations are set forth for us. So we are trying to find out from the general public and from the local government officials who are giving these people the authority to operate, what is the difference with these people and taxi service. They want to be able to distinctly say that we're not a taxi company, but you're providing a service that is similar to what taxi service is, which affect the regulated market employees. Well, we're not employed, but independent contractor. And there's a definite show of we don't care, we want to do what we want to do. As Brother Mark and Brother Frank has said, these people do not want regulation, but they want to be able to operate the way they see fit. Take, for instance, within what happened in Sydney, Australia just a few weeks ago, within the price surge, in terms that they don't like to be hear us say that they're price surging, but the term they use is dynamic pricing, whichever way is charging more. Yeah? To get people out of the way of danger, that is also totally wrong. In our city, in Austin, Texas, they were introduced to the market, like Brother Frank said, unannounced. They approached the city council in Austin saying that we want to be able to join the market because in Austin, Texas, you guys are going through a drunk driving epidemic and we would like to help you to fix that problem. They were told by the council to go and sit down with the stakeholders to come up with some plan, something that is similar to what taxi has to do. As far as regulation is what the mayor told them, he would like to see something that resembles what the taxi drivers have to do. 2 weeks later, they decided that we're going to launch because Austin, Texas hosts one of North America's largest music festival, South by Southwest, which was coming up. And because of the crowd in Austin at that time, they called the city back and said, guess what? We're not going to wait for your decision. We're not going to start operating. So they started operating illegally also in Austin, Texas, which is right now decreasing the income of taxi drivers in Austin, Texas. We have seen so far, they have not been in Austin for a year yet, and we're watching drivers' income decline 20, 30, 35% currently. What they came to Austin with, the model they would like to use in Austin, Texas, is to be able to use unlimited amount of cars. If you're using unlimited amount of cars in a regulated market, what you're actually doing is saturating the market with your vehicles, taking over that market, and then you want to, under the pretense that you're not doing that, we here at the National Taxi Workers Alliance are willing to stand up and fight tooth and nail for our families and our brothers and sisters' income, just like any other normal person would do in any other industry. We are here today to send a message to these folks to let them know that driver power, union power, we will not stop fighting until we get our rights back and we are able to operate the way we were before these crooks came into the market. Crooks they are. You cannot tell us that we are in the work field every day performing this duty. These people come in and they decide, okay, we're not taxi. Take, for instance, as a ground transportation provider, one of the reasons why they do not want to be called a transportation provider is because they're not providing transportation to the American with Disability Act sector of the society. They do not own a single vehicle. They do not want to invest into vehicles that will provide wheelchair service for people with disability. We have seen in other cities where people with service animals have been denied rides, and those that are not denied rides, their service animals were placed in the trunk of the vehicle. Now, you cannot do that to a person with it's a federal, guideline that you must provide service to these folks. And if you look around the country and even contact them and ask them how many wheelchair accessible vehicles do you have. Not one vehicle. Uber is a startup company in San Francisco 4 years ago, and it's not too many startup companies in the United States within 4 years that your revenue has gone up $41 million. I don't have much time. I'm to signal that I have a minute, and I'd like to turn it back over to my assistant, Ms. Bhairavi Desai. Thank you very much.
So we're going to skip around the table for a bit. Our next speaker is going to be Mateos Chekol, who's an organizer, a member of the staff of the organizing department of the AFL-CIO, 11 million strong in the U.S. And Mateos has been working closely with the National Taxi Workers Alliance and our affiliate in Montgomery County, Maryland, as well as generally in the D.C., Virginia, Maryland area. Mateos Chekol.
Thank you, Bhairavi, and thank you guys for coming out today. And I just want to say, the 11 million members of the AFL-CIO are behind the taxi workers as they take on these so-called ride-sharing corporations. As Bhairavi said, I've been working mostly in the D.C. region, Montgomery County and Prince George's County in particular. Montgomery County is probably one of the wealthiest counties in the country. And actually, last year passed a minimum wage increase, which was one of the highest in the country at the time. And so, for many of the taxi cab drivers in Montgomery County, the question has been, how could you, allow these, millionaire taxi companies and billionaire so-called ride-sharing corporations to come in and make millions of dollars off the back of these taxi workers, and not do anything about it. And actually, recently they've introduced legislation to legalize Uber in that county. And our response, the response of the taxi workers has been to say, why is it okay for a billionaire corporation to come in and operate under a different set of rules, while the taxi drivers are operating in a different set of rules? And in addition to that, we're also saying, to our customers and to our passengers, we are asking for a universal taxi dispatch app in the county as well, because we understand that for us as taxi drivers, we're there to serve the public, we're there to serve our customers, and if you take away the convenience of the app, right, which is being able to take you from point A to point B via your cell phone, what else does Uber have to offer? If we have that as cab drivers, why is it okay then now for this Uber corporation and this Lyft corporation to come in and operate under a different set of rules? That's been a big struggle for us in Montgomery County and in the DC suburb in general. So I'm proud to be here. I'm proud to stand here with the National Taxi Workers Alliance as we take on these corporations. I won't really say too much. I think for us as the AFL-CIO, we take our direction from our affiliate here at the National Taxi Workers Alliance.
Our next speaker is Brother Mark Urata. We're so proud to have Mac with us here today. He is the Inland Transport Section Secretary of the ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, representing 5 million strong unionized transport workers from across the globe. And we've been working with MAC and the ITF to very much organize ourselves city to city, country to country, continent to continent, because just as these companies have been waging a global offense against us, we know that we need to wage a global fight back. And so we're very honored to be doing that in coordination with the ITF. Mark Urata.
Thank you very much, Bhairavi, for the kind introduction. As introduced, my name is Mark Gruberg from the ITF. International Transport Workers Federation. I'm responsible for the so-called surface transportation members of the ITF. We're based in London, founded in 1896. Currently we have members in 170 countries, and both the National Taxi Workers Alliance and France Union from Belgium, BTB, are proud members of the ITF. We have been following the expansion of these Uber taxis around the world, and whilst they boast that they operate in more than 50 countries, we have realized and found out that in 19 countries, in some way or another, the regulators and the policymakers and law enforcement agency, one way or another, have banned this company. That's about 36% of their worldwide operation, and that really tells the story. These countries include Canada, Brazil, Colombia, Australia, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and then countries in Europe like Belgium, Denmark, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, and Spain. And I have some detailed list of these, what the bans are like in these countries. And for instance, in Canada, your neighbor, cities like Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton have said no to Uber. In the states of Australia, including New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia, and Queensland, the same story. And you know very well about the rape incident in New Delhi, where the government since then have announced no to Uber. And in South Korea, the company will be prosecuted or indicted if they come to the country. And in London, Uber does operate, but there was an incident where a female passenger was verbally harassed by an Uber driver, and so she complained. And you know what the company responded, or how the company responded? They said, "We apologize, and here's a credit of £20 to your account so that you can use this money in your next ride." That's the level of their quality of professionalism. Recently, Frank and I were in Washington, D.C. attending the Transportation Research Board conference, and we had a senior representative from the left who said that in San Francisco, 80% of the private passenger drivers drive their cars empty. So we want to use this space to put passengers on. So I challenged her because according to OSHA, taxi industry is a very dangerous place to work. 20% more to be murdered on your job. And then I think the fatality rate is about 14.9% in the 100,000 workers in the industry. So I said to her, how do you protect these amateur drivers from passenger assault? And she said, well, we have the app, we can follow those perpetrators and track them. But that's too late. And that really gives us this massive concern that this company is not really a real taxi operator in their profession, and that they are just out there to make big money. And that's why, like I said, different governments and policymakers in 36% of where Uber operates do not want them in. One more important point is that we also have this Global Employers Association for road transportation industry called the IRU. They represent employers in the trucking industry as well as bus and taxis. They don't want this Uber in their business as well. And we recently signed up to a joint statement with this IRU so that the labor and the employers on this particular issue are on the same page. And we will be sending this message to every country, every government where Uber operates, and whenever they make announcements that they are coming to country A or country B, the message will be delivered to those governments. Last year in October, we had a day of action with the ITF affiliates, unions who opposed to this expansion of Uber. We had our members from the Philippines, Thailand, India, Belgium, Great Britain, and US, cities like San Francisco, Philadelphia, and Chicago instead, participate in this Global Day of Protest. And we will be repeating this if necessary. Cuba is not welcomed in the rest of the world and in the US, and they have no place to hide because ITF and its affiliates are global labor organizations, and their members, wherever they go, we will follow them, name and shame them, and get them out of the business. Thank you.
So our next speaker is going to be President Ron Blount of the Taxi Workers Alliance of Pennsylvania. Ron is also the Vice President of the National Taxi Workers Alliance, and just as Max spoke to more of a broader global picture, Ron will touch upon both Philadelphia but also the broader picture of what's been happening in the U.S. itself. Ron Blount.
I started driving a taxi in 1983. And just basically, I just want to give you a quick overview of what a taxi driver day is like. They usually shift for 12 hours, and we get 2 rush hours. Either you get a rush hour during the day shift or a rush hour during the night shift. It's during that rush hour where taxi drivers make about 60% of their income. The other times of days, you know, like I might be out there, I might make $5 1 hour, $10 1 hour. Most times during the day, I'm taking old people to the doctors and stuff like that. The problem with the so-called rideshare companies is they come and cherry pick during the rush hours. So when drivers' incomes are cut during those rush hours, it's hard for them to stay out on the streets when times are slow, to take people who don't own a credit card or don't have a smartphone. What's in Philadelphia, the impact for us is that Urata came in without legal authority. And I think that is that is minimized so much. When corporations, big corporations like that come in and create complete anarchy, where local governments can't stop them. And the only way you can stop them is by giving them what they want, giving them regulations to come in. Not the same regulations as taxi cabs. If they had the same regulations as taxi cabs, we believe that we can completely compete with them. But they want regulations not to be inspected. They want insurance that isn't covering the whole shift. You know, that it creates gaps within coverage. They want to be able to price surge, to charge what they want to charge in times of bad weather or disaster. Whereas taxi cabs, we have to maintain a certain level of integrity throughout our shift. So I'm just going to be really short. Like for the United States, what I do find is those 3 things. It's corporate anarchy. They don't care what government it is. They go in there and they totally violate the law. And if they're not adhering to government law, how are they going to treat their workers? Number 2, there are insurance gaps between the personal coverage insurance or the private cars and the gap between their so-called $1 million policy. A lot of people are going to fall through it. And the 3rd thing is the price surging, the way they're able to rip off hardworking people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. And so coming back to New York, we are really pleased to have with us today City Councilman Ben Kallos. Thank you, Councilman, for joining us.
Good afternoon. I'm Councilmember Ben Kallos. I used to be a union-side labor and employment attorney representing Laborers International Union of North America, UNA, and still represent the workers of the city of New York. My district is the Upper East Side, Roosevelt Island, and Midtown East, as well as El Barrio. And I have to say that for my district, we have one subway line. We have the 456, which is over capacity. So I'm actually kind of proud to say I took a cab to get here. I'm going to take a cab to get to my next meeting. There's a cab stand at 79th and York that I take with a lot of other government employees who take it right down the FDR to get to City Hall every morning. We take the walk over. And I come from a district that loves our yellow cabs, loves our drivers, and think that New York City wouldn't be the same without our yellow and now green cabs. Because no matter what, you can always get a cab. And if it's raining, if it's snowing, if it's hailing, if it's a superstorm, we rely, and in fact our mayors and governors call on our yellow and green drivers to be our public transportation infrastructure. And so when I saw everything that was going on here and internationally, I was thinking, what can we do as government to do better? And I think one piece that's missing is, so I'm a city council person, I'm now responsible for our government. It's a $77 billion budget, 8.4 million residents, 350,000 employees, but the medallion, that's from the city of New York. That's something we offer, and that's something that we rely on for $1.2 billion in income in the coming year. And that income is now diminished. And every month we hear that the price we can expect is going lower and lower. And when it comes to the market, I'm a big believer in the free market. I'm not really a big fan of banning things. If it's poisonous, I want it out of the marketplace. But I do believe in regulation, keeping passengers safe, keeping drivers safe, and keeping people walking on the street safe, because we're all in this together. And so along the lines of what the AFL-CIO is advocating for in D.C., I proposed legislation in New York City for a universal e-hail app. And so that's the top line for most people. But the key piece behind it, which I'm actually going to be fighting with the TLC about at their upcoming hearing, because they're only taking one piece of it. They're keeping the e-hail app of it, but they're not keeping the core. So the key piece is something called an open API, an application program interface. And what that would say is every yellow and green, about 19,000 vehicles in New York City, would be able to use their dashboard system, which is the TPEP-LPAP system, to log in and say, I'm available to take a ride. And whether it's a New York City app, an Uber or a Lyft, or if the drivers got together and decided they wanted to build their own app, it could be built, and everybody would be able to have a fair chance at hailing. So instead of giving it to one person or another, they would actually have open competition. And I think one of the pieces that certain players are looking at is having an anti-competitive business model, and by having an open marketplace where anyone can hail any yellow or green depending on where they are in the city. You could only hail yellows if you were below 96th or 110th in Manhattan. Everywhere else you'd be able to hail both. But the key here is anyone can hail, so Uber would be able to actually have people compete with them. And everyone wins. The drivers win because they're now able to take hails from anybody. The passengers win because all they care about is being able to get into a vehicle and not have to pay an unknown fee. You don't know how much you pay when you get into an Uber, and either it's going to be what you thought it was, or it's going to be 10 times more than that, and some people have $1,000 to get to work in the morning. Some people have $7 to get to work in the morning. So that's the hope behind it, and I'm really passionate about the open API to just give everyone a level playing field and make sure that we adapt. Uber can be disruptive, but government needs to adapt, and we need to support our medallion and support our drivers. And at the same time, we also need to make sure that we create a level playing field so that the next Uber can come and disrupt. And there might be the next big app out there. We just don't know about it because it hasn't come across the table. When I grew up, I used MySpace. No one thought you could beat MySpace, and then Facebook came along. So I think that's just something to keep it into perspective. And then ultimately just making sure that whatever app we have is fair, that everyone can use it, and protects everybody. So that's something that we're fighting for, and I was really excited to come, and I was a late RSVP, but I really wanted a chance to meet the drivers and say thank you, because I don't own a car. I don't own a car. I live in Manhattan, and there's a lot of places where our mass transit system isn't where it needs to be, and we need to get our subways and trains to support our infrastructure. But that's years and billions of dollars away, and until that happens, it's our yellow and greens that are the backbone of our city. So thank you to the drivers who do 12 hours all the time and keep us safe and are professional. And I think just one piece I'd like to touch on. When you're in a yellow or green, something goes wrong, you can call 311. There is accountability. There is an entire judicial system around this. Something happens to you in Uber, good luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. We'd actually like to open it up if anybody would have any questions or comments. Dan?
Yeah, I have two related questions, one for Mark and for the councilman. The two questions are, what happened to Flywheel and all the other apps you mentioned? Why weren't they successful, or maybe they have been? And for the councilman, Uber now allows, you can use your Uber app now to hail a ride in Manhattan or anywhere. Would your vision not allow the hailing of an Uber car? Well, they don't call it a street hail, is the reason. Would it permit the hailing of an Uber car, which is neither a yellow cab nor a green cab, or not a yellow cab, within Manhattan?
So any third party, whether it's Uber, Lyft, Flywheel, whoever it is, would have access to the Open API. Right. Through the Open API, you can hail a yellow or green, and you know what rate you're going to get. And then they're not allowed to incentivize you. They're not allowed to block it. They're not allowed to put up a message saying, why use this because we're going to be cheaper maybe. Everyone would be able to hail. And then if you're not, then you're able to hail whatever else they might want to try to offer you.
But whatever else. You know, it's very simple. Can you hail a non-yellow cab in the central business district of Manhattan?
Not on the city app, but if a third party wanted to tie into the Open API, they could also offer the ability to hail one of their own vehicles.
Right, but would it be allowed?
Yes, they would, but they'd have to do it electronically. There would not be any street. Right. So there would be no street hails for anybody else. The street hail rules stay the same.
No, but the question is,
yeah.
Can you, if you're say on York Avenue in 79th Street, where you are?
Yes, through a third party you could. Through the New York City app you could.
No, would you allow someone standing on the street to use Uber to hail, or would the universal app allow a person to hail a non-yellow cab to 79th Street, New York Avenue?
On a third party app, yes. Sorry, so
then what do you...
So then it's contemplating, so there's a limit to government. Government cannot do an unconstitutional taking from a private body. So what I can do...
That was a bizarre thing to say, but go ahead. Where does that come in?
I cannot command a third party to offer yellow and green hails through their app.
No, but you can prevent them from taking a hail app in Manhattan. That can be allowed. That can be a law.
Not my legislation.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to say.
You got it.
Any question?
What happened to Flywheel and the other apps you mentioned?
Okay, so Flywheel is now in use in virtually every taxi in San Francisco. It is competing with Uber and Lyft and the others that exist. The thing about Flywheel is they only have a tiny fraction of the investment that Uber does, or even Lyft. And so they haven't been able to spread themselves to other places. And the amount of publicity, and I'd say free publicity, that Uber gets and Lyft gets is really astounding. One time, in the course of writing a letter to the editor, I Googled the words Uber and Lyft and Flywheel, and I got something. I got a couple of thousand hits for Uber, and I got something like 10 for Flywheel. And we have our own unlevel playing field where we have much lighter regulation on the Ubers and Lyfts of the world than taxis have. And it's not only unfair to the taxi drivers and the taxi industry, it's really putting the public in danger, because the whole purpose of regulation is the protection of the public.
Well, in my understanding now, and tell me if you think this is wrong, Uber allows its app to be used by yellow cab drivers in New York or green cab drivers or whatever the regulated cab driver is in San Francisco, I assume. How does that? Do they not want to use it? Do they use it? Is it a good tool for them? And if so, why do you need Flywheel if they can just use the Uber app, which is presumably a lot of people have on their phones already?
Are you asking why they can't just use the Uber app to hail a taxi?
No, I'm saying the taxi drivers can use the Uber app. Real taxi drivers, the regulated taxi drivers. I don't know what they're using. I don't know, yellow in San Francisco or what. But why do they not want to use it? Or are they using it and they just don't like the competition from the non-taxis who are also using it? Or what is the relevance of taxi drivers being able to access the Uber app right now, which I understand they can?
Okay, so this is kind of interesting. Uber, as you may know, has about 4 different levels of service, and one of them is Uber Taxi.
Exactly.
Uber does not support Uber Taxi in the way it supports its other services. For one thing, they have been known to gray out the taxis in their fleet at busy times. So it gets busy, there's surge pricing, people are going to naturally turn to taxis. They take taxis off of their system at that time, so you can't get a taxi. The other things that they're doing are, if you are a user of Uber Taxi, they will be sending you text messages luring you out of Uber Taxi and into their other services. They have special deals and special promotions to get you to stop using Uber Taxi and use their other services. Conversely, they are also appealing to taxi drivers who use Uber Taxi and trying to get them to stop driving taxi and moving over to their other services. So they really have a disreputable reputation among San Francisco taxi drivers. Some use it, for economic reasons, which is understandable, but nobody likes them.
Question about the success of some applications and non-success of other applications. In Belgium, you have regular taxi companies who operate with an application. But you have Uber. Nobody talks about regular taxi companies who are operating with an application. Everybody talks about Uber. What's the difference? The difference is that these regular taxi companies have not the same amount of money to invest in their marketeering. And secondly, they don't attack the legal system. They are working within the legal system.
I understand.
And apparently it's very sexy to attack the legal system. It's very sexy to attack the working conditions of workers. It's very sexy from a certain perspective. And I think that's the great difference between the success between regular taxi companies working with an application. That's apparently not innovative. And an aggressive player who attacks the social system in our country, for example. That is sexy, apparently.
I just want to add on with that. So Uber is not Flywheel, and Flywheel is not Uber. We can call Flywheel TNC because that's app-based system that people use to go, or to request a cab. But Uber, they're doing the taxi services. And I want to tell you about the New Year Eve that Flywheel said all the customers pay flat rate, just $10, wherever you go around the city limit. Customer paid just $10. And let's say, example, the meter say $15. The driver get paid $100. Just to support the drivers and to tell the people, well, we exist. We are here. There is no need to go to other company because we existed before them. We don't need them. And Uber, when people driving for them, they're committing insurance fraud. They're not professional driver. Flywheel doesn't have driver. They just have an app that professional drivers use. So I just want to clarify that there's a big difference between both of them. People are supporting Flywheel. Most of the taxi drivers in San Francisco using it, and we encourage everyone and every taxi driver to use Flywheel in San Francisco. And a lot of them, they're coming back from Uber to drive a taxi.
Because like you said, this is now a global problem. This is not a New York City problem. This is not a London problem. This is not a Brazil problem. It's a global problem. And one of the big problems in this industry has been that everybody has been acting in a very myopic fashion. And says, we are local. Like politics is all local. Well, this is no longer local. So congratulations for getting people together to come up with a strategy, if you will. Second, Barry, just as a correction, when you say a $40 billion war chest, they do not have a $40 billion. They have a $40 billion valuation, which is totally meaningless until they go with the IPO. So if you're successful, the $40 billion valuation can plummet overnight, just like medallion prices have dropped 15% or 20%. So that can be also reversed. So the total money that they have is about $3 billion today. What they've succeeded in doing very well is raising money, which they're then using to take on the entire world. And like you said, ignore the politicians, treat everybody with contempt, like you said. And that's what I think our politicians need to realize. Uber could care less about the politicians. Uber could care less about the businesses. They just want to make themselves as rich as possible through the IPOs. And there are governments, not governments, but individual billionaires who are willing to just throw money at them in the hopes that they're going to get returns 3 to 10 times what they invest. So what I'm not seeing, though, from governments, and maybe this is directly to you, Mr. Kallos, is teeth in the regulations. We've seen over the last few weeks that the TLC has no way to stop Uber, because when they shut down the 5 out of the 6 or 6 out of the 7, I don't know how many bases on the black car side, they were back in business the next day. Because what does $200 fine mean to a company like Uber? Zero. So what the TLC needs is more support from the city council and the government to put teeth behind the regulations. On the other hand, the TLC and the politicians are kind of vacillating about which way to go because of, this must be, it's disruptive, so it must be good, right, from a technology perspective. So that's the real problem that you all have. Not just you, but we haven't even talked about the existing owners of black cars or limousines or yellow cabs or green cabs. I mean, they're in a tizzy as well. They don't know what to do. So you need to basically get together on this to fight something like this, which is, I agree with you, illegal on the surface and behind the scenes.
I agree with almost everything you've just said. Government needs to be better at regulation, and when we regulate, it cannot be a cost of doing business, but it must actually have the full force and effect of the law. Along those lines, campaign finance is one of the most important things that we can do. It limits the ability of a $3 billion or $40 billion valuated company to be able to spend. We have no corporate spending in city politics. That is one piece of it. And along those lines, it means turning out and organizing and getting the workers to come out and speak to politicians and say, this is important to me. And for drivers to mobilize their passengers so that passengers are saying to their politicians, this is what we want. And I believe the yellow and green cabs cover 6 million passengers a day or something outstanding like that, which is huge. That's more than most public transit systems in anywhere else in the world. The other piece of it is ethics reform and making sure that somebody who is a TLC chair or commissioner or a politician can't just cash out and start working for Uber and not lobby their own body. So what that means is they have to wait 1 year after they're done in an industry position, decision-making position, and then they can make as much money as the private sector wants to make. And along those lines, it means we can no longer allow vendors and the private sector to dictate public policy decisions, which is the other shocking thing that I have come into. And I'll say it publicly, I will not let a vendor, I will not let special interests dictate public policy. They should.
Quick comment that may I comment on that?
Yeah.
I just want to kind of quickly comment on, from our perspective, I actually haven't talked about what's really happening in New York City for us. I mean, it's true, in New York, Uber, we're on the topic of Uber, does not operate a ride service, or, in the sense that they are here a regulated livery and black car company. And, as opposed to like in places like Chicago and Boston, where they're giving the jobs away to private motorists with in private vehicles. And we have seen, when we go out into those cities, the poverty among drivers is so palpable. You walk into a restaurant in the middle of the day and the whole place is crowded with taxi drivers. And something is wrong on the streets. Because, these are hours that drivers would much rather spend, working. Those are the best hours of the day for them. And we're just seeing it, city to city now. And part of what's so offensive to us is, even though they may be a legal operation, quote unquote, in New York City at the moment, we don't want to see them use their millions and billions from New York to destroy the livelihoods of our brothers and sisters in other cities, first and foremost. Secondly, from what they have done in other cities, we know that is the end game. They want to try to bring in, rideshare, quote unquote, into New York City. They're doing it by entering it first as a legal market, unlike what Lyft did. Lyft came in and just said, Sidecar a couple of years ago came in and said, we're just going to start picking up. And, because of our advocacy, we've gotten the TLC to have a, street hail enforcement unit. And so they were able to go out and they spotted the Sidecar vehicles and they started impounding. And Sidecar said, we can't keep up with these fees. This is not what we want to spend our money on. And they left, and then they advanced that same operation in throughout California, where the law enforcement and regulators, we're not as protective of the industry, and of the drivers or the riders. Lyft came. Meanwhile, Uber came in as an e-hail app. And going back to your question, Dan, part of the reason that they have Uber T is because they want to sell to the public that they have the most number of vehicles available through their app. But they don't do as much to encourage people to take the taxi, the yellow or the green cab, in the way that they encourage them to take what they call Uber X or Uber Black here, which, Uber X here might be livery, but in other parts of the country, Uber X is actually their private vehicle service. And so imagine when, all the New Yorkers who might be using Uber X, seeing it as a legitimate service, and then when they take a flight to Chicago and they see Uber X, they're thinking it's also legitimate service there, not realizing these are private vehicles that are decimating a professional industry. And so we don't want to get used in that way. And given this is their end game, we've been going to public hearings in other cities. I was out in San Francisco with Mark and Chakib, and out in Boston, and we've been out to Chicago, in Austin, and in Philly, where there have been hearings. And you see the representatives of these companies who give a song and a dance about why they can't produce simple numbers, but how many vehicles they have. Oh, I don't know. But they go out there and they say, we have the most number of vehicles, or we need more drivers. Well, if you don't know how many vehicles you have, how do you know you have the most number of cars? How do you know you still need more drivers? But the basic, simple little things, they claim that they don't have information on. And it's not that they don't have it. They just don't think that they should have to give it over. They don't think they should be under any kind of regulation. And, going back to the point that George was making, traditionally, historically, even though we are a hyper-regulated industry in most parts of this country, all that regulation has been on the backs of drivers. And so most of these regulators, they don't know how to regulate any of the private capital. In New York City, look at the number of cases we had of overcharges by taxi fleet owners. In our 18-year organizing history here, I can tell you, word by word, most of the few rules that protect drivers came because of our organizing. Prior to that, none of them existed. And so most of these, regulators, they were ill-equipped to respond to Uber because they had turned a blind eye to when illegal pickups have proliferated in our cities, because it wasn't affecting the fleet owners who still got their money up front. It was only affecting the drivers, so they never cared. They didn't have enough enforcement to go against, any of these activities because they're too busy enforcing, ridiculous, arcane rules and regulations against professional drivers who they've impoverished for all these years. And so it's against that backdrop, right? And part of the reason we're responding so passionately to what's happening is because you have a company like Uber that says we are in advance. They're not in advance, they are in assault. And that's what's so problematic, because we need an advance. We need an alternative. Part of the reason that so many professional drivers are leaving, that have left the taxi industry, for example, in New York, they've left the fleets to go and work for Uber X or Uber Black Card, is because the fleet owners have overcharging them. They filed lawsuits to stop a historic healthcare and disability fund that would have given thousands of taxi drivers benefits on the job for the first time in this industry. So, so when they talk about the fact that the medallion value has fallen by 25%, well, forgive us, because we're not going to shed one tear over that. They have been milking us dry for decades and decades. But so let us be clear. Our objections to what Uber and these companies are doing is by no means to protect the industry that we've been struggling in for all of these years. We are desperate for an alternative, but we recognize that a conglomerate like Uber is not going to give us an alternative. They're dragging us further back. So these are historic conditions of inequality and exploitation. That's their real platform. App companies talk about their platform. Make no mistake, the real platform of these companies is the exploitation of drivers and the decimation of consumer rights. That's what they're building their software on top of. And when they see that software, the color that we see is red, because that's drivers' blood that was shed to build that platform. And that's why we're organizing ourselves. Poor people have poor organizations, okay? We don't have their money, but we've got the people. I was in Boston, and there were drivers there, veteran drivers, literally had, tears in their eyes, who said, if I bought the medallion that you sold to build this convention hall. Now I can't even pick up outside this convention hall. In New York City, we lose 50 cents on every trip in green cabs and yellow cabs that goes back to the MTA to finance, to subsidize buses and subways. We don't have access to bus lanes. But on top of that, what is Uber doing? They're out in Albany right now to say their black car customers can't afford that much of a tax on black car fares. Wear a t-shirt, it's got to be a collared shirt, and you can't paint your color a different shade of yellow or a different shade of green or whatever shade car, taxi it is in your city without the permission of the city. And to watch those same regulators bend over backwards and at public hearings literally say to Uber and Lyft and Sidecar and these companies, well, what kind of wording would work for you? And then they take notes to come up with rules. You know, in public settings, we all know in politics, and there's a lot of dirtiness, you know, of all the lobbyists behind the scenes. These people aren't doing it behind the scenes. They're doing it out in public, in front of us. You know, I was in Boston, a room full of 300 taxi drivers with signs, and there was one Uber executive, and it was that one executive that they all bent over backwards to please. Didn't give a damn about the 300 workers who were standing there taking time off duty from their jobs to say, enough is enough, I'm going to go beyond homeless if you continue with this. And our so-called public servants in that city just simply didn't care. It is so offensive. It is so unethical, and it's unbelievably destructive. And we don't want to see millions, even from a legal operation, from our city, being used to wreak havoc on our brothers and sisters across this globe.
What are booking drivers in the New York Taxi Workers Alliance to combat rideshare programs?
Well, we're part of what we're doing now. You know, we want to really start exposing. I mean, New York is the media capital, you know, and part of it is we feel coming from New York. We want the word to get out there that this is actually a backward company. This is not a forward-thinking company. And by the way, just like they price gouge on passengers, what they're doing to the livery and black car drivers here is, you know, when they because in their quest to crush taxis, they keep lowering the rate for the livery and black car drivers. They're not lowering the fees that they charge to the drivers. They're just gutting the income of the drivers instead. If you have a car now that if it's over 4 years old, you're no longer a Uber Black. You're now a Uber X, where you make less money. So even if the TLC says you can have your car on the road for up to 7 years, Uber says even if you've invested $50,000, that car is no good after 4 years. And they don't put the money out to do the inspections on these vehicles. And even if you pass the city inspections, it doesn't matter to them. So you could have a car, you know, that's 4.5 years old, that's in a better condition than a car that's 2 years old that may have been in an accident, and yet you're the one that's going to take the hit because Uber won't put the people, you know, they won't spend the money to go out there and inspect these vehicles. That's how they operate in the rideshare model. So even within the legal context of the New York model, they're still using the same kind of, you know, cost-cutting measures from their private, you know, privatized business model and bringing it into here. So, you know, we got to expose this. People have to know about it. The truth has to come out. So first and foremost, we want to expose this truth, both to the general public. You know, people might, you know, people, I think, take it for granted. You know, you forget that, you know, we serve 1 million passengers a day. I wish it was 6 million. That's okay. Yeah, no, it's okay. Wishful thinking. Million is pretty amazing. 1 million a day in you know, this industry. We are the 6th largest, you know, transportation network, if you know, compared to if you know, within the country, just in the taxi, livery, black car, green cab sector alone. So, you know, people don't realize that, like, you know, drivers have, you know, an affinity for their passengers. There are many drivers out there. You know, you build relationships. These are people that you're serving. There are many people that remain in this industry that feel like, you know, this is a good job. I enjoy talking to my public. I enjoy talking to my customers. If you remember when they wanted to bring in the TV screens in the back 7 years ago, one of our objections was it's going to interfere with the conversations between the front and the back. Because that's important to keep you safe in the cab. It's important to keep tips, and it's important to keep your sanity when you're working 12 hours and you're by yourself. You're working on holidays away from your family. These are the conversations that mentally, emotionally keep you going, not just bring your income in. And so the fact that the passengers are being cheated left and right, we want to expose this. Black car drivers, they lose out when Uber cuts their rates. So do we. Because, we're facing an unfair competition. So there's a lot that we can unify ourselves around. Right now, Uber in New York City, wants to pit the black car, the livery, the green cab, and the yellow cab drivers to compete against each other for the few crumbs that they're throwing on the streets. What we want to say is we want to unify the drivers for where we can share our unity and turn it back against these companies, that are trying to profit off our labor and off our remaining, disunited. That's why our unity is so important to us.
Hi.
Thank you, Councilman Kallos. Thank you.
Thank you,
Have you ever been talking about sort of a new kind of alternative that the union might help promulgate among its members? Because it seems like, from what the gentlemen from San Francisco say, that it's impossible to compete without marketing dollars, even if you have your own app, right? So if is it possible to make it work with your own app, or is the only possible solution a regulatory one to try to squeeze Uber out?
Well, we definitely plan to see, because one of the conclusions of our meeting is that we want to organize drivers around one app. I think the details of that will be coming out in the future. But the other, because none of Uber, even in the private sector, cannot continue to operate without professional drivers who know what they're doing, who are going to be dependent, so they're the ones who are going to be more available compared to the part-timers or folks who already have a job and may want to try to do this on the side. Uber and Lyft and Rideshare, none of them are going to be able to sustain themselves eventually without the professional drivers. So by organizing ourselves, we know that alone is going to have a significant impact on how much these companies are going to be able to expand themselves. And so that's a power we have. We're sending a message that it's a power that we plan to use to protect ourselves. The other thing is the models of co-ops, both in Montgomery County and also in Philadelphia. I want to turn it over to Ron. Many drivers, where possible, it has not been possible in every city, but in cities where it is possible, more and more drivers are beginning to form co-ops to economically organize themselves. So maybe Ron can say a few words about that.
Yeah, so basically Madison, Wisconsin, Alexandria, Virginia, Denver, Colorado, San Jose, California, Montgomery County, Maryland, and Philadelphia soon have established these workers' co-ops where we can pool our money together to stand up to capital and get a fair exchange for our labor. I think this is an upcoming trend with taxi drivers that are independent contractors that can come together and find justice, in our daily lives. Thank you.
Well, I just want to add something about what Bhairavi said earlier about Uber. They're not answering the question how many vehicles they have or how many drivers they have. Well, we collected a 10,000 private car operating in San Francisco only, illegally, because they don't have insurance. We called the biggest insurance company, and no one of them provide any insurance coverage to people who use their personal car in the commercial purposes. So it's very clear now that they're operating illegally, and everybody knows it. The insurance company knows it. Politicians know this. Everybody. We just want to address that to the public and tell them, we care about your safety. So do you. You should care about your safety also. Thanks.
So, Austin, I hear you about Uber, and I agree with you that it is exploiting drivers, but how do you address the young professionals of color who love Uber? There was an article in the New York Times in October. There was just an article, Joy Reid from MSNBC, that was one of her favorite things in 2014. So how do you address them or have them become allies when the yellow taxis aren't picking them up in the first place? I mean, if you dig deep, if you come to these meetings, you understand what Uber's doing, right? I completely agree with you, but most people of color in the professional world love Uber because they don't have to stand on the corner for 15 minutes, 30 minutes. I mean, and at the end of the day, the taxi driver, right, he's getting slashed again, right? He's always been, you know, the little guy, the sweatshop, right? And then people of color have felt, right, and not validated, right? So it seems like it's leveling the playing field in some areas because you get to go from point A to point B. So how do you address that, if I made myself clear? And please don't tell me that it's not happening, because it does. So let's get to how we can help people of color not dump on other people of color. Because at the end of the day, we know who has the money and who's holding the purse strings.
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. And I just want to say that I have a question. There is something so special about Uber that I still don't know why. Because they're operating illegally, and for me, respond to your question is, it's not a matter of people are car or not. I want to look at it. I want to look at it this way.
They don't. The Uber driver doesn't know what color you are when he comes to pick you up.
Exactly.
Well, that's right. They don't know. Anybody
No, but you plug into. The point is that when someone, a black person, calls for an Uber cab, the cab driver doesn't know what color he's going to pick up, so he goes.
Well, there is a picture of the customer that the driver sees.
Drivers don't see the picture. At least not in New York.
Well, in San Francisco, they see it. Yes.
That's where we live.
I mean,
Ask a question to me. I'm from San Francisco. Okay. Pleasure to meet you.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I mean, it's definitely something like, I think that we are hearing from like various people, right? And throughout this conversation, and not only in New York, we have this discussion's also come up whenever we're in different parts of the country. And so, I mean, I think one thing that's important to note is that there's still most of the refusals here are still mainly about destination-based. I mean, when you look at all the data, you know, from coming directly from the complaints themselves, that a lot of it is about, in terms of on the metered fare, what's going to happen, you know, the fact that if you're going to areas where people think it's going to be a long ride and they're not, when they're coming back empty, then for a yellow cab driver, because of the level of expenses that people take on, that there's an economic disincentive, right? And I'm saying that because from what you see from the complaints that are filed at TLC, most of the complaints say that the refusal takes place after the destination is noted. And so I do think that's important, because at least the reports that you get from the TLC, the data shows that when we talk about refusals, majority of the refusals are based on destination, right, which is an economic issue. No, I know. Right? I agree with that. I'm not saying it's legitimate, right? I'm not saying that the refusal should happen by any means. I'm trying to explain kind of the dynamic that I don't think it's just about race. I actually think a lot of it is about destination based. And so according to TLC data, that regardless of the race of the person, that based on certain destinations, especially times of the day, if you're going to go empty, let's say from Manhattan into Brooklyn or the Bronx or Queens or Staten Island, and you're coming back empty, particularly for certain hours of the day, there becomes a big economic disincentive.
Right, and I get that. So
right.
My question is how do you get people of color to be an ally for the Taxi Workers Alliance when it's based on location? It's race on the passenger side, and it's money on the driver's side. I mean, that's the way I see it. So my thing is, it's like, what campaign can be done, right? Because Uber, right, yes, that's a bad guy, but so are these garages, and some of it, the TLC. So as long as they're making money, they don't care. I mean, no person of color ever got a cab, and Uber's still making whatever, $18 billion a year, nobody cares. When we can jump in line, I have a business meeting to go to downtown. So I want to help the driver, and if he's not going to pick me up, then I might have to pay another $5-10. Now that's a whole other discussion, but I still need to be able to get to where I need to go. So the question is like, how are you on this panel going to get people of color to understand, right, the deeper message, what the underbelly of what's happening? Because I'm telling you right now, people of color who make $500,000 a year cannot go outside and take a chance on getting a taxi when they just did a deal worth $30 million, so somebody sees them not being able to get a cab. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. I mean, in terms of the economics, right? So our approach has been that the economic factors that are involved in this, see, they've always been ignored. The city has never, ever addressed them. So, for example, little issues like traffic rights. So, for example, there are a number of places in Manhattan where you cannot turn. A vehicle can't turn. Only a bus can turn. Even if you have a passenger, or even if you don't have a passenger, it doesn't matter. Yellow cab can't make those turns, which gives us a major disadvantage. And so at certain hours of the day when you're stuck longer in traffic, which we're seeing more and more, that really influences the driving patterns of drivers, and particularly driving patterns of going outside of the central business district. And so that, we've talked about, the city needing to really address that as an economic reality for drivers and something that ends up affecting the public. Because it limits the mobility of where taxis can travel without taking a big economic hit. And to be honest with you, we, Taxi Workers Alliance, we supported the Green Cab program, particularly because we said, well, within the outer boroughs, we can't justify to people that if you're in Manhattan, there's a metered fare and you have certain protections because of regulation, and in the outer boroughs, you shouldn't be given that same protection. So we supported the Green Cab program, but it's also meant that when people have gone we're now losing fares in the outer boroughs. So even the stuff that's happening with Uber, it's happening on top of some of the hit that we actually took from the Green Cab program being implemented. We've continued to support it, not specifically because we have said it's something that's necessary for the public, and the economic that we're taking from it can still be mitigated in other ways without it affecting the public.
Right.
And so, part of our approach has been, that's one thing. The second thing, we've actually had this proposal for a long time. In order to get a license, right, you have to go through a school. The schools that run the programs, we've actually talked about that part of that curriculum actually needs to talk about the issue of race, like the civil rights history in this country. That particularly for a workforce that's 94% immigrant, and you're living in, working in cities that are so, diverse, right? And people, diverse meaning people coming from different histories. There has to be a way where you develop a language for people to talk about and understand. I mean, I grew up in this country, right? But I came here when I was 6. I remember as a kid, when I was growing up, there was like the Dot Busters movement in New Jersey, and so there were like Indians who were killed, and it was a pretty rough time. I remember, we got chased down the street several times and things like that. I didn't have a vocabulary to go back home to talk to my parents, to talk about racism, American racism, because they had such a different context. They didn't experience, any of that, right? And so we're like, it's important that as part of the training for drivers, that there's both an educational program that does not ignore the dynamics of our culture, that talks about these issues, that but have civil rights activists that can really get people, to flesh out their own understanding of race, right, and to develop their consciousness around, racial equality in this country. We've had that proposal on the table for more than 10 years. We've never been able to get it done by the city. And so that education component is important. Looking at the economic factors is important. And because the fleet owners don't get hit by it, that's why these economic factors are never discussed. And then I think the third thing would be that, part of why we want to get the story out is we don't want the story of, race-based refusals to not be told, because that is important. That's part of how our consciousness gets raised, and it's how it's holding people accountable to a better society. That's an important story. What we want to do, though, is separate it out from the idea that somehow Uber is a socially conscious company that is out, right, to change this dynamic. And so I think part of it, from our perspective is we want, within communities of color, we want the discussion to be changed, around who is going to address issues of, racial bias and racial inequality. It's just as you said, and it's not going to be, $18 billion, breaking in company that's going to address it. And so I think part of it for us is we need to start separating out, these two stories, because they're not one and the same. And partly that's part of the messaging that we want to start to get out there. But the real ways to address this, it's not that you want an app that's going to make, kind of make people invisible, because we don't want that, right? The solution here is not to say, well, it's not for an app company to say, well, we're going to make you, quote unquote, kind of blind to race, because you're not going to be able to see the customer. The point here is to say we want to raise the consciousness of the drivers, of the industry, of the regulators, to say that we need to create a system where everybody visibly gets to have the same access. And we actually think having an app, that the app actually does the very opposite of that, So, and it's important to us to build alliances. We used to do town hall meetings all the time. We used to have town hall meetings in particularly, neighborhoods where you have, large communities of color, to be able to have exchanges between the community and between the drivers, an honest exchange from both sides about, about this reality. We want to be able to go back to that. But when you have when you allow a conglomerate to really flourish, it takes away from the grassroots level our ability to actually have these conversations, and that's been part of our concern.
Okay, can I add a word or two? I think it's a really important question. And, I speak from San Francisco perspective. I have to say that I drove a cab in New York for a couple of short periods of time back in the 1970s, so I'm a bit familiar at least with the industry and the problems as they existed then and to some extent currently. So I absolutely agree that the education is a really important aspect of this, and I can tell you that in San Francisco, part of the driver training, and there is a driver training course which separates us out right there from what these ride service companies are doing, because they do little or no training. Part of that is customer relations, sensitivity to people of color, sensitivity to people with disabilities, and so on and so forth. That is part of that curriculum. Maybe we have a smaller problem in San Francisco about that or what. I can't say that it doesn't exist. But another part of it is, I think some of it falls upon the passenger to report these incidents and make sure that the authority, you see, we have an accountability system in the taxi industry. There is a government agency or a government department that can deal with this. If you have a problem with an Uber driver, you only have Uber to go to. It's a wholly different thing. So I think part of it falls upon the passenger to make sure that any form of discrimination is reported, and to follow up and make sure that report is followed up and that something happens at that point. So I think those are really important things, but I think also, to have an apples to apples comparison, you need to compare what happens when a passenger is using, let's say, an Uber app versus what happens when they're using a taxi app. And that's a big piece of the reason why we are saying that we want to see a universal taxi app that can be used by taxis across the board, and then let the customer compare what they're getting when they get into an Uber and what they're getting when they get into a taxi. And with that comparison, we think taxis win out, hands down, for any number of reasons. And just the last thing I'll say on this is that an app is inherently a discriminatory type of service, because you have to have a smartphone, you have to have a credit card before you can even use it. Taxis serve everyone. They are obligated to take everyone where they want to go into every neighborhood. We know it doesn't happen all the time, and that has to be dealt with. But, we are under an obligation not to discriminate, and discrimination is built into the very, core of their operations. So, this is an issue that regulators must understand, the public must understand, and this is a message that has to come out.
Mark, really quick. Just add.
I want a quick time check. A few people have flights to take out from here, so we're just going to have another 10 more minutes.
I'm going to speak, I think, just from personal experience, I think, as a person of color. I live in Washington, D.C., and I think, Mark really, and Bhairavi really hit the nail there about, making sure we have an equal comparison, but that, the reality is there, right? We can't, and I think we need to be able to address it head on, and New York has taken the issue head on and addressing it. They've had, folks come in to talk about the issue. But let's be honest here, right? Uber is not some, race-blind corporate, philanthropy, right? I mean, in Washington, I'm speaking from Washington, D.C., and the experience there has been, if you look at Uber's advertisements, right? If you look at their advertisements on the metros and the buses, you see all these, young white people plastered all over as your drivers, right? As your nice English speaking American drivers, right? That's who you'll get with Uber. You get into an Uber car and you get immigrants, people that look like me, driving you. And you know, it's completely dishonest. I think, you know, what they're trying to say is it's extremely xenophobic. You know, don't take a cab with some immigrant. Come take Uber with this nice white person in my car. When the reality is, if you look at an Uber driver and you look at a taxi driver, they're almost identical. In fact, you know, a lot of our members that are members of our taxi unions also drive for Uber. In addition to that, you know, if you look at the way Uber operates, right, they don't serve poor people. They don't serve in areas where there are folks that are concentrated, where people of color are concentrated. In the DC area, for example, you go to Southeast, you know, you can't get an Uber down there. No Uber driver goes down there. You know, you look at areas where a lot of, you know, poor people are, where they don't have credit cards or smartphones, right? They're not getting Ubers. And so I think this, you know, and I blame to a certain extent the media. I think the media has done an awful job in, you know, having this superficial analysis about race when it comes to, you know, what Uber does and what taxis do. You know, I think, and I think that's something we can do better. I think, you know, Uber's out there to make money, and that's all they care about. And I think, you know, we need to expose that some more.
How it entered the market was because of the fleet owners, and I was wondering if you could expand on what fleet owners have done to create a niche for Uber and what your union is doing about it.
Well, I mean, in the sense that, you know, there are many professional taxi drivers that in New York City, where Uber is a livery and black car operator, there are many professional taxi drivers, you know, used to lease from fleets that are now going to, you know, bought their cars or leasing their cars from Uber, and they're operating livery or black car. I mean, from things like, you know, continually raising the lease, you know, overcharging drivers on the lease, you know, making up bogus fees. I mean, the Taxi and Limousine Commission has a cap, but the many fleets continue to violate that cap and, you know, charge drivers, you know, above it, sometimes up to the point of like $10,000 above what they should have been charged, which is $10,000 loss of income. I mean, it's with working with the State Attorney General's office and the Taxi and Limousine Commission, which now has a lease caps enforcement unit. There were, you know, major cases of overcharges by Gene Friedman, who's like I think now the biggest taxi owner in New York City, 900 medallions, and SLS Jet Garage, which is down the street from us. There's a number of other fleets I know that are currently being investigated. I mean, the settlements that the AG's office and the TLC have made with these fleets in these cases is like well over $3 million now. So, and these are settlements. Imagine how much the drivers were actually cheated if the settlement number is like $3 million. And, you know, to the point of like, you know, shift change. I mean, Ron was saying earlier, you know, what happened, so taxis are double shifted. So during rush hour, you know, that's when drivers have the shift change. More and more garages moved into Queens, away from Manhattan, and they dispatch the car to you late, even though the car is there. They're waiting to see how much tip money they're going to get from you. So the longer they make you wait, the dispatcher knows instead of a 5, you're going to give them a 20 to get out of there on time. And so they're still charging you for the 12 hours, even though by the time you get into Manhattan to start picking up fares, you know, it's closer to like 6 o'clock. You know, you're so close to the 59th Street Bridge, you're just trying to get over the bridge to get into Manhattan. But, you know, by that time, you've lost an hour and a half of your shift. And so during that time, meanwhile, liveries, you know, black cars who are mostly single shifted have an advantage by already being in those areas where, you know, yellow cabs are expecting to pick up the fares. And for a night driver, for example, so, drivers average like $190 per shift on lease and gasoline. The rush hour during shift change is critical time. If you don't make your money then, you're either going to end up working until wee hours of the night, or you're just going to have to pay out of pocket, or just take a big income loss. And so, and so when you go into the livery or black car sector, you're not paying for the medallion lease. You're paying for the vehicle, and Uber's taking, for example, 30% of your fare, including on the tip. And they keep fluctuating their rates. So, over the summer when they slashed their rates by 10%, that meant black car drivers took a 10% dip in their gross earnings, right? But the expenses to Uber stayed the same. So many of those drivers are now beginning to come back. That's why we're saying Uber is not a real alternative, because at the end of the day, the amount that you're losing to them ends up being, being very close to what you end up paying in the yellow cab industry. But also, the way that drivers get treated. I mean, you should check out, I encourage all of you, go and check out your local taxi garage operator. The space, like from the time you open the door to where where the window is, where their staff sit, it's like maybe like at the most there's like 3 feet of space. It's like set up for like some sort of like riot control. So more than 2-3 drivers can't be standing in there at one time. Right? And so even on a rainy day or in the cold of winter, you're waiting an hour for the cab to pull in, you're stuck standing outside. There's no restrooms. Well, sometimes you could be waiting 2 hours in there. They don't open up their bathrooms to drivers, even while you're waiting. To the way that, that they talk to drivers. Also, similarly, the TLC enforces, like the police and the TLC inspectors, they target the yellows much more than anybody else, the way they randomly pull you over, which ends up being an economic loss for the driver, even if you haven't committed any infraction, but they have the right to just randomly pull you over. So all of that, in the middle of a very hectic 12-hour shift, where you increasingly in Manhattan don't even have space just to pull over for a bathroom break, let alone a lunch break. I think all of this is really added up, and people are desperate for an alternative, right? And so, okay, if there's something out there that possibly might work, why not try it out, So, what we've been continuing to do, and our healthcare and disability fund, we had a historic victory to set up for the first time 20 different benefits: vision, dental, disability, a term life insurance policy for 30,000 taxi drivers. What happened? The fleets, who weren't even going to have to pay a penny into that fund, Orcus filed a lawsuit. They lost because the court said they didn't have standing. So then they rounded up two sets of lawsuits, rounded up 3 drivers for each one to go and file a suit, which they basically financed using the same old lawyers to take away benefits. That what was it going to be to them? They weren't even going to have to pay for it. And drivers were going to have benefits for the first time. They would have retained more drivers if they had not taken away that benefit fund from us. So we're fighting to get that back.
So I guess my real question is, to what extent is the high price and small number of medallions causing this problem?
The high price
of medallions?
Well, for us it would be the medallion lease, because majority of drivers, maybe about 15% of the medallions might be owned by drivers themselves, and it tends to be groups of drivers because no one individually can hardly afford it now. So the lease that we have to pay, there's no question. See, so even working for black car industry, even if you're losing 30% per fare, right? you're not beginning the day at a negative with the high medallion lease that you have to pay in the taxi industry. The leases have to start coming down. If these fleet owners want to be competitive, start lowering your lease. Your cars are just sitting there at the garage. Instead of letting the cars sit idle, lower your lease. Maybe you're going to take in less per car, but you're going to take in more money by getting more cars out compared to what you're getting with them just sitting there. And it also allows the taxi industry to stay competitive by having more taxi options for the passengers. You know, so fleet owners, I mean, instead of crying that the value is falling, you reap what you sow. Start lowering that lease. Stop fighting drivers. Treat drivers with decency and respect and rights. A standard contract with benefits. That's the way they can compete with Uber. They don't need an app to compete with Uber. They need to bring in dignified working conditions into the taxi industry. That will get the taxi industry back on track.
The fact is that in New York City, the Taxi Limousine Commission have deputized the entire city of New York. Anybody, a pedestrian can be walking in New York City and notice that a yellow taxi did not pick up any passenger. And that person can call the TLC 311 and make a complaint, and that driver, in 3 occasions of refusal, is out of the industry. So a TLC knows very well that there are calls upon calls, you know, if this eventually happens. If we make about 1 million fares a day, and actually the refusals number are very, very low. Statistically, it's like 0.0001% of refusals, right? So it's not really a heavy-duty issue. We taxi drivers, we are terrorized. We drive at 25 miles an hour. We follow the laws. We do not want any complaints whatsoever. I mean, anybody can complain against a taxi driver in New York City. It is remarkable the way the situation is. So I want to make an issue of that, in particular as a taxi driver. I think that very, very seriously about, you know, refusals.
So guys, I'm so sorry. This has been such a fantastic conversation. But some of our, you know, our brothers and sisters here have to catch a flight. So I would just like to thank everybody for being here. We're still going to be here. So if anybody would like to, you know, speak with those of us who can stay, please do so. We'd love to continue the conversation. But again, thank you everybody for coming.